My name is Murray, just one of the pastors here. So I get the privilege of just opening up the scriptures and just unpacking it a little bit. And we're going to be in Mark chapter 5, beginning at verse 21. So beginning verse 21 of Mark chapter 5. And there is also a few Bibles here on the table. So if you don't have a Bible, you can grab one of those and follow along so that you can just see what it comes from. Because we're reading in the book of Mark, which is an eyewitness account of the things that happened in Jesus' day. And so we'd love for you to be able to follow along. If you don't own a Bible, just please take one of those Bibles with you. Take it home with you. It's our gift to you. And then I would encourage you to read the whole gospel account of the Gospel of Mark. And so to get everything. The part we're going to read is really where Jesus is just going to come across from the Sea of Galilee, where on the other side of the sea, he has set a man free who was basically living in the tombs. He was demonically oppressed, and Jesus was able to set him free from that affliction. And now the snake crusher is going to become a funeral crasher. In Mark chapter 5, beginning at verse 21. Here's our scripture.
The Gospel according to Mark, chapter 5, verses 21 to 43. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet, and implored him earnestly, saying, My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live. And he went with him. And a great crowd followed him and thronged him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garments. For she said, If I touch even his garments, I will be made well. And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed from her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, Who touched my garments? And his disciples said to him, You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, Who touched me? And he looked around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, and fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house someone who said, Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, Do not fear, only believe. And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping. And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside, and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to them, Talitha, cumi, which means, Little girl, I say to you, arise. And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat.
So here's our scene then in Mark. Opens up then in Mark chapter 5. The scene opens. We have one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and he is desperate because his only daughter, we learn that in the parallel passage in Luke, is on the brink of death. Now, you got to imagine the turmoil that this man is feeling. I mean, he was one of the religious leaders, and he's in that same group of religious leaders that really had opposed Jesus. And now his little girl gets sick to the point where she's near death, and there's absolutely nothing, at least humanly speaking, that can be done. So what a dilemma, because it's this Jesus who had been accused by them of doing his miracles by the power of Satan. And now we've got this religious leader who's humbled, he's broken, and he who's used to having really the people bow down and seek his favor as a respected religious leader, now he's willing to actually embarrass himself, and he's going to face the ridicule, the opposition of his own peers by coming and just kneeling down at the feet of Jesus as a desperate father, because his only hope really is mercy and grace, especially after what he has done to oppose Jesus. And what does he receive from Jesus? Grace, right? God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Jesus is not like me. Because you know how I would have responded. Sure, now you need me, huh? Right? But there's no biting sarcasm in Jesus, just pure love and compassion. And so Jesus goes with him. Now, this guy on the outside is quite a contrasting figure to the naked, cut up demoniac who had dwelt among the tombs, whom Jesus had just left on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. But though Jairus is neat and clean and religious, he's just as needy as the other guy. He's just as hopeless. He actually has no ability to overcome and deal with death. And so this is his little girl, right? It's his only girl. And he's powerless to do anything about it. He's powerless to save her. And so here we have this man, Jairus, though a religious leader, yet he's powerless to save her. He's beggarly poor. He's now falling at the feet of Jesus, who once said, "Oh, blessed are the poor in spirit." So he's absolutely dependent on Jesus. He's got nothing in himself to overcome death. So Jesus said in compassion, he goes with this man. And the crowds, what they do is they begin to throng just to see what Jesus is going to do. And then we have this interruption. And Jesus stops to engage this woman who's made her way through the crowds then to Jesus. And we read this in verse 25, right? And there was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years. And who had suffered much under many physicians and spent all that she had and was no better, but rather grew worse. So she's broke and she's got no healing. In fact, she got actually worse after all the doctors are done with their remedies. So she was suffering not only from her disease, but also from the cures. And here we have a woman. And we know that under the law, during the time of her period, she would be unclean for 7 days, according to Leviticus chapter 15. And anything that she touched was then considered unclean, which means that she was kept away from community. She was kept away from the worship of God. She would have been forbidden to enter the temple. And this woman had this ongoing bleeding, and she would have gone then 12 years without touch. Because this woman was considered then defiled, destitute, and desperate. For 12 years, she's had this affliction. For 12 years, and no one has touched her or hugged her or laid hands on her to pray for her. And if she had been married, well, she's obviously divorced and abandoned. So for 12 years, no one had kissed her, no one had held her hand, and so she was lonely and isolated then in her suffering. And her suffering, if you think about this, was the same length as that little girl's life. We're told in verse 42, right, that she was 12 years of age. And so think about this. While one was being presented then at the temple as a newborn, the other was being cast out of that same temple and being shunned. And so one had all the religious system had to offer, and the other was condemned in and by that same religious system. But all the religion in the world, even having the ruler of the synagogue as your daddy, cannot save you from death. Now, if you look at verses 27 and 28, we see that this woman has heard the news about Jesus, and so now she's going to act upon what she's heard. So she sneaks in through the crowd and she touches his garment, believing that that would be enough to actually heal her. And so for her to touch his garment was going totally against the religious law. She had to skip over the law in order to touch him. But grace is always greater than the law. If she followed the religion of the law, she'd be left outside, she'd be defiled, destitute, no hope, considered an outsider. But she needed grace, and that's what she believed Jesus offered. So there was no delivering power in religion. The law of religion simply said, stay away. Grace says, come close. The law condemned. Grace says, there's room for you, and Jesus in grace has time for you. So the power of God flows to you when you trust in Jesus. And when she touches him, what's really cool is he does not become unclean. She becomes clean. He does what religion's absolutely powerless to do. Now, I need you to believe this today by faith, that whoever you are, whatever you've done, however dirty, disgusting, defiled your life has been, you reach out to Jesus in faith, you don't make him unclean. He makes you clean. And the power of God is unleashed to give you new life. So this woman on the road, is a picture really of all who are saved by faith, reaching out to Jesus, receiving new life. You can interrupt Jesus. I mean, he might be the king of the universe, but he's always got time to deal with you as a child. Notice in verse 30, Jesus is perceiving what has happened. He says, "Who touched my clothes?" Right? Who touched me? I mean, doesn't Jesus know? I mean, but I think it's kind of like when God was in the garden and Adam, right, was hiding and God comes down and says, "Where are you?" Right? He knows perfectly well. But he's drawing out Adam. He's drawing him out. And here Jesus is drawing out this woman. He's exposing her. And he's exposing her not because she did something wrong, but actually because she did something right and good. Because her touch was a touch of faith. And we need to understand that faith is not an intellectual term where you understand certain truths and you believe them. Faith in the Bible is always a relational term. Faith reaches out and touches and rests on a person. Look at verse 33, what begins to happen. So he draws her out. Who touched me? And she begins to be singled out. The disciples don't even have a clue what's going on. This figured, what do you mean, who touched you? There's a crowd, right? And so you can imagine, though. So what happens is she's now drawn out. She starts telling Jesus the whole story. She's coming clean, right? But imagine poor Jairus. He's looking at his sundial wristwatch. You know, and I know I watched too much Flintstones as a kid. For you internationals, Flintstones was a cartoon about a caveman family. But anyway, but what is Jesus doing? That's what he's got to be thinking. Like, come on. Doesn't he understand the situation? I mean, we've got to hurry. We've got to get going. It's going to be too late. This woman can wait. I mean, she's already got her healing. What are we doing? But my daughter right now needs you. That's what he's going to be thinking. But how often is it that we do question Jesus and his ways and his timing? Right? And Jesus wants us to see in this passage that his grace and his love are actually compatible with the storms and with what to you may seem like unconscionable delays. And might I say that because of this delay, both this woman and Jairus are going to receive far more than they asked for. Because maybe things won't always go according to the way that you expected or you hoped. But don't fear, only believe. Both Jairus and this woman got far more than they bargained or begged for. But it might actually demand more faith than we would also like to exercise. But let's not put ourselves on the throne and start judging God when we don't have all the facts. When we only have a snapshot in time and we don't have the big picture. This woman, what she wanted to do is just touch and run. She just wanted a drive-by healing, right? But Jesus won't have it. He gives her forever wholeness. He adopts her in love as a daughter. That's far beyond what she even wanted or anticipated, right? He calls her, do you see that? He calls her daughter. And she's likely older than Jesus, but she's now a daughter of the King. He's not ashamed to call her daughter. She's in the family. You see, she didn't have a daddy like Jairus to care for her. So Jesus actually stepped into that role. I'll be your dad. my daughter, he says, right? Verse 23, right? When Jairus first comes to Jesus, he says, my little daughter, right? And so he's interceding for his little daughter. And Jesus now says to this woman on the road, my little daughter, your faith has saved you. And that's what he really brings out. We see that word translated in the middle of verse 34, faith has made you well. It's actually a very interesting word. It's actually a variant of Jesus' own name. It means God saves. What a picture of our saving Lord, because you think about it. There's a passage in Isaiah, one of the prophets they said in the story video, Isaiah chapter 64, verse 6, that tells us all our righteousness. That's all the best things we could possibly do. It says all our righteous deeds are as filthy rags, literally filthy menstrual rags. And Jesus put on that filthy garment, and he bled out on the cross and clothed you who take hold of him with his righteous robe. What a picture. And through his blood that flowed on the cross, we who are unclean can become clean. And not just for a few moments on that road, but forever. And so this delay with this woman, Jesus creating this great picture for us of what he would do on the cross. But this delay becomes a real test for this religious leader, this ruler of the synagogue, Jairus. And he's already feeling like Jesus isn't going to make it on time. So now he's probably totally freaking out on the inside, but Jesus just won't be hurried. And then the news comes, right? Verse 35, the thing that Jairus has feared all along happens. Verse 35 says, but while he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? So here we've got these men who now come and they say, come on, let's face the facts, be real, forget this Jesus stuff, right? There's nothing he can do to help you now. I mean, we could cut you a little slack, right? When your only daughter, when she was sick, right? You got a little crazy. You went through this thing, but now it's over. She's dead. So forget this Jesus nonsense, right? Nothing can help. That's what they're saying. That's what these voices are saying. That's what they're bringing now to Jairus. But there are times when you have to ignore some voices. Some faithless, pessimistic voices. Jesus just ignores these voices. And what he does, he confronts Jairus. He says, are you going to listen to these voices, these unbelieving voices, or my voice? Who are you listening to? Who are you listening to? In verse 36, Jesus says, do not fear, only believe. Now, you have to imagine how Jairus feels at that moment, right? A little bit of confliction happening there. But you got to think about that. He was not there to see his daughter die, his only daughter. And as a daddy, you want to be there in those last moments. If this should ever happen, you want to be there because you want to be kissing your daughter on the forehead. You want to be holding her, right? Just bawling your eyes out, telling her how much you love her and that you're thankful for the years that God has given you and that she was such a joy and delight to your heart. And you want to say your goodbyes, and he wasn't there. And it wasn't because he didn't love her, but because he was trying to save her, because he did love her. And so this man, he's just heartbroken. He's just destroyed. His life's in shambles, and his daughter's dead. So Jairus needs his faith kind of propped up a little bit. So Jesus speaks the word, do not fear, only believe. Now, God's sense of timing is going to confound ours. His grace just rarely operates on our schedule. And when Jesus says this to Jairus, he's also looking over this man's head, and he's speaking to us. Don't be afraid. Just believe in me. Jesus is speaking to you. He's speaking to me. And Jesus says, I'll not be hurried because I love you. I know what I am doing. And if you try to impose your understanding of schedule and timing on me, then you're going to really struggle to feel loved by me. But it's actually because of the delay that both the woman and Jairus get more than they asked for. So just be aware of this whenever you go to Jesus for help. When you pray for help, just because things don't work out like you expected or desired, just remember this episode with Jesus and Jairus. And when you go to Jesus, you get far more from him than you ever had in mind. But Jesus will demand from you far more enduring faith than you anticipated. So Jairus is not just given the news that his daughter is dead. He's just given that news. He is given that news. And now he has Jesus look him right in the eye and looks this man in the eye, just having received this worst possible news of his life, and says, trust me. Because you got to remember, Jairus doesn't know the end of the story like we do. So you got to kind of put yourself in what he's going through. And I'm sure it seemed like to Jairus that Jesus had no good reason for delaying, right? For letting this horrible thing happen. But he didn't have all the facts. Remember this. There is information that God has that's not available to you. So can you trust him? Right? Has he not shown both love and faithfulness? But how arrogant I think we can be at times. You know, sure, you're the eternal God. Sure, you've lived from all eternity with all knowledge and you understand all things and you've created and sustained the universe and all that. But why don't you know any better about how my life should be going? That's arrogant. Right now, is God delaying something in your life? Are you ready to give up? Are you impatient with God? Consider that just maybe there's some crucial information that you don't have access to. So the answer, as with Jairus, is to trust Jesus, to trust him. So Jesus, he hears about the death, and this is what I love. He hears about the death. Your daughter is dead. Came those the news people bringing them the news. And what does Jesus do? He keeps on walking. He keeps on walking toward death. Don't miss that. Some may be wedding crashers, but Jesus, he's a funeral crasher. And later we're going to see even, you can read the story in Luke chapter 7. There's a widow there, and her only son, and he dies. And it's been carried on this thing, and Jesus crashes that funeral. And then we're going to see there's another passage where his friend Lazarus, you can read about that in John's gospel account, John chapter 11, I think it is. And it's his friend. First he was sick, and then Jesus says because he loved him so much, he didn't go. And then by the time Lazarus' sisters, their names are Mary and Martha, and they come to Jesus and bringing him the word and said, well, there's no point coming now, Jesus, it's too late. Right? Their brother's been dead now for 4 days, and it says, and the body stinketh, the King James Version says. Which means that the body's even started to decay. But Jesus doesn't stop. He just keeps walking toward death, including his own. And he even interrupted his own funeral. So anyway, in our story here in Mark, here they come. When they arrive at Jairus' home, we see it in verse 38. There's a lot of commotion going on. There's weeping and there's loud wailing. And you see, because in different cultures, there's different mourning practices, right? If you're British, you keep the stiff upper lip, right? You don't show your emotions, right? And that can lead to a lot of problems, but that's how they would try to handle it. But for other cultures, right, you're not really even mourning unless you let it all out in just loud wailing. And that's this culture, right? People in that culture, they would even bring in wailers. Some were even paid, or professional wailers. They would come in because they were recognized in the community as wailers. That was their giftedness. That was their thing. They were experts at it, and they'd receive gifts for coming to you, bring them to your funeral. You'd give them gifts so they would come. You know, like Bertha, she can be heard for over 20 blocks. So you want her there for sure. Because you see, that was a day without phones. It was without internet. And so that's how the news about death spread. You would hear all this loud commotion going on. There'd be instruments and wailing, and people then would gather around to see who died. And so here the wailing has already started. And in verse 39, Jesus asks a question, why are you making a commotion and weeping? Like, duh. Like, doesn't he know? I mean, this is what Jesus does, to draw people out, to teach. Because he's not asking because he needs an answer. He asks questions because that's what gets people's attention. And so he says the child is not dead, but sleeping. And Jesus often speaks of death as sleeping. That's what he said of Lazarus, who had been dead 4 days, and the body already had started to decay. He said he's sleeping. It was Jesus' way of communicating that death is not final. Death is our great enemy, but death does not have the final word. Jesus is the final word. And so they laughed at him, these mourners, right? Which shows to me that maybe their mourning may have been a bit of a sham, more culturally what they did than truly identifying with Jairus and his wife in their grief. It was really a product of their external religion, but not deep love. You know, when you walk with Jesus, you have to be prepared to be laughed at. You got to prepare for the naysayers, for people to shake their heads at you. Because when you choose to go a different way from the crowd and to do something that doesn't entirely make sense, prepare for people to maybe mock or question, think you're an idiot. People thought that about me before that even, I guess. So, but hopefully you get the idea. But Jesus, in doing this, he's not coming against mourning, right? He's against the idea that death is ultimate, that death has won, right? Because the statement isn't don't grieve, but it's really don't grieve hopelessly. Like those who have no hope, because it says, I am here, Jesus says, and I have come, and I'm here to crash and break up this funeral. So don't fear, just believe. That's what Jesus has said to Jairus, right? The opposite of faith is fear. That's what is always used in the Bible. And so fear raises its head against faith all the time. And that's why we often see them just put in opposition to one another in the scripture. So fear is keeping some of you from completely surrendering in trust to Jesus. But whose voice are you going to let control you? So let's keep considering the passage. And may you see that Jesus is truly worthy of your trust. All of it. In verse 40, we see Jesus sends away the dissenting voices. He goes into the room with the dead girl along with her parents and Peter, James, and John. And Jesus again is going to go against the religious commands. He's going to go against the religious practices, and he touches and holds the hand of this dead girl. And that's something, again, according to Leviticus and all the passages of the law, would make a person unclean, defiled, right? It's touching a corpse. But Jesus just crosses the barriers of uncleanness to restore to wholeness again and again. So in verse 41, it says, taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha Kumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. Now, Jesus here speaks in Aramaic. It's a very common expression. It's just the everyday language of tenderness that she may have heard well pretty much many mornings. This word Talitha actually means more than just little girl. It's a term of endearment, like what we might say is sweetheart. Or we could say, dear little girl, get up. So there's no big show, there's no big wand waving, no Shazam, right? Jesus just sits there on the side of the bed and he softly says, hey, sweet girl, time to get up. I worship that man. And he lifts her out of death. Oh, hold his hand. Because if you do, death is just a nap that he'll awaken you from. This is our Jesus. Now that's power. And when the one who created the stars and put them all in place, when he takes you by the hand and he says, my dear child, it's time to get up. That's power, because not even death is a problem. And remember what Jesus had said to this guy when he heard his little girl had died? What did he say? Do not fear, right? Only believe. Now, why would we ever be impatient with someone this powerful, this loving, who treats us this tenderly? Why would we be impatient with somebody like this? Jesus identifies with us, right? He who knew no sin became sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. Jesus became like that demoniac on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. That day on the cross, he took the identity of that man where he was naked and he was cut up, crying out. And he became an outcast and he bled out on the cross, identifying with the woman on the road. And he became like this dead girl, identifying with sinners, for the wages of sin is death. He lost his Father's hand at the cross. And he went into the tomb so we can be raised up out of it. He lost hold of his Father's hand so that we can know that once he has us by the hand, he'll never, ever forsake us. So Jesus identifies with his own and substitutes for them. He died our death so that we can experience his life and peace. He loves you completely. He knows what he's doing. And soon it'll be time to wake up. In verse 42, it says, and immediately the girl got up and began walking. For she was 12 years of age, and they were immediately overcome with amazement. And this amazement, and it was a joy they couldn't have known except for the death and that momentary heartache. It was now a joy full and inexpressible, but because of what they had experienced. And then in verse 43, and he strictly charged them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. Get her something to eat. Because Jesus' kingdom is a physical kingdom. And that's why all the big deal in the Bible about resurrection and bodies, not disembodied spirits in a spiritual place called heaven, but real physical bodies, resurrected and glorified, where heaven comes and intersects with and restores a new earth for the glory of God. See, God created a physical universe to put his glory on display, and those who die in Christ will one day get up again. But this time with an immortal body, no more pain, no more tears, no more dying, with Jesus, in relationship with him, in increasing joy forever. This raising of this girl from death is not normative, but Jesus is saying, one day it will be. I'm giving you a foreglimpse. I'm just giving you a foretaste in breaking up this funeral of my forever kingdom. Just a foretaste of what life with this king is like. Death does not ultimately win. Jesus wins. And Jesus rose from the grave, and he's coming again to raise up from the grave all who have believed and followed him. Maybe your faith though is very weak. Well, bring your weak and broken faith to Jesus, because it's the faith of the weak placed in the right object, Jesus. The weakest faith that looks to and placed in the right one will serve you just as well as the strongest faith in the right one. So if you surrender and cast yourself upon him who is able, his strength is more than enough for your weak faith. So let's imagine our scene once again. Jesus just sits on the side of the bed and just says, "My beloved child, arise." She opens her eyes. Who's the first person she sees? Jesus. Who's the first voice she hears? Jesus's. And the first touch she feels, Jesus's. And that's a picture of the resurrection from the dead for all the children of God. That when we die, because of sin we will, but for those who belong to Jesus, for those who've been given the right to become the children of God, on the other side of death, you'll see the face of Jesus. You'll feel the touch of Jesus. Revelation says will wipe away every tear from our eye, and you'll hear the voice of Jesus. Jesus will be there to meet you on the other side of death. Jesus will be there to meet you on that day of resurrection as he was there for this young girl. Jesus is the funeral interrupter. And he interrupted my funeral as well because I was dead. I was spiritually dead to God, separated from him, and he's life eternal, and he in grace has granted me life. There's an adversary whose goal is to create funerals, to deceive, to blind, to destroy, to bury us. And we're far more broken than just being bad. We're dead, the scripture says. A lot of people think, I'm not that bad. And so their goal is to improve themselves. After all, there's always that one person who's way worse than I am, right? I'm not as bad as that guy. But the gospel says the bad news is worse than that. We're dead in sin, permanently separated from God, incapable of helping ourselves. Dead people can't do anything to help themselves, and that's a problem. But Jesus came from heaven, walking toward death. And you're saying, well, isn't it too late? I mean, you don't know. Maybe you think your life is in such a state and sin is such a hold of you. It's been holding you for so long. It's too late to help you. You just got to remember who Jesus is. And Jesus comes and says, no funerals today. I'm the resurrection and the life. And Jesus was already buried in my grave. He laid down in death, taking my death, my sin, my guilt upon himself that I might arise in righteousness. He holds the keys of death and hell. And he doesn't turn from the sight of death. In fact, he reaches out and touches the dead. So let him interrupt your funeral today, in advance. So I may have a funeral, but the day is coming when Jesus is going to take me by the hand, and he's going to call me by name, Murray. And he's going to call you by name if you're his. My beloved child, arise.